Okay, welcome back to Tiny Towns Villagers. Today I'm going to be playing Tiny Towns Villagers solo. Now there are some new additions to the game in Villagers, like Animal Meeples, for instance, and a few other changes as well, and additions. New types of cards. So we have the Clock Tower, that is from the Villagers expansion. We have Traveler's Center, Nectar Farm, and Outhouse. All of these that I just mentioned are from the Villagers expansion. So they're the new cards that you can use with the corresponding buildings. Just some of the many that they added with the Villagers expansion. Another thing you'll notice is we have these two cards here. These are called Villager cards. They're also new to this with this expansion. And then we have this Lodge board here. That's also new. And it talks about how you work with the villagers. So you'll notice here you have two resources, and then you have a villager. Then on the next turn, you'll have two resources. You'll place your additional resource here to build the cottage. Now the villager is still there. Then you'll construct the building, and look, the villager is still there with the building. You want to possibly get your villagers in these buildings. So when you're when you are constructing a building and putting down resources for that particular building, you're going to want to try to do it nearby a villager. Okay? Now let's say I have a resource here, and I still need two resources to construct the cottage. But I place the glass one right here. Well, at the end of my turn, I have to move this villager now. And so now the villager has to move to an empty adjacent square, meaning it has to move here. Okay? Then, on my next turn, if I place the next resource there, for instance, and the villager is there with it, I can now construct my building by taking the resources away and choose a location for the building. If I put it here, the villager will stay here. If I put the building on the spot where it was being constructed as well, and the villager is currently there as well, then it will actually count as sharing space with this building, meaning this villager will actually be inside the cottage, technically, providing you support for these abilities. Each of these abilities cost a villager working inside of a building to use them. So cut corners, for instance, requires you to have one villager in the building working, obviously, in order to activate this ability on your turn. Renovate here requires you to have three villagers, so all three of my villagers would have to be inside of a building working for me to activate Renovate this ability here. This ability here on my turn. Okay? Now, if I have one villager, working inside of a building, but my other two are not currently in a building working, then the only one I could activate would be this one here, because it requires only one villager to be working. Now, when you do use an ability, you have to pay the cost. So the cost is one villager. So you have to move this villager who's currently working in the cottage to your lodge. This is a lodge board, okay? So you're going to put the villager here, okay? Which is really cool. Then, after your turn is done, so at the end of your turn, if you have any villagers sitting on the lodge, then you will move them to an empty spot on the board of your choice, as long as you have an empty spot to put them on. You also can't share space with another villager. So this is not allowed, okay? If you cannot place a villager because you have no empty squares, then you can't place a villager, obviously. An empty square is obviously a square that doesn't have any resources or any buildings, on a square, okay? So that's something to note. Okay? Now, I also wanted to talk about, let's see here. What else do I want to talk about? Oh, yes. So let's talk about these cards here and their abilities as well. So the outhouse is new to the game, to me. The outhouse is this building here, and it's going to give me a victory point at the end of the game, and it can hold 1 resource. When another player names a resource, you may place it on this building. So normally when you play Tiny Towns, there's a master builder. The master builder chooses a resource. You might not like that resource. But if you have an outhouse, you may place that resource on the outhouse instead of placing it somewhere on the board in an empty spot, obviously. And each outhouse can hold 1 resource. So as long as you have multiple outhouses, you could do that multiple times. But you're limited to just 1 per outhouse you have, obviously. Now, and then of course, with that said, if you're playing solo variant, so here I'm playing the solo variant, getting ready to anyways. When you play the solo variant, you don't have a master builder. Instead, you have these cards here, which are only used in the solo variant. You draw the top 3, you get to look at them and choose one of the 3 to use to build a building in your town. So, if none of these, or if these were all the same, you didn't want to use brick or wheat or glass, and you wanted stone or wood at that exact moment, and you couldn't get that at that exact moment, you could still do that, basically. You could take one of these resources and place it in the outhouse instead, if you're playing the solo variant. So that is the difference. Of course, you have 3 to choose from, so the chances of that happening possibly are probably not as probable as if you're playing with a master builder. So that's an option. And then, of course, when you use a resource card, it gets put to this. It gets sent to the discard pile, and then you draw 1 new card. So you always have 3 to look at and choose from. At some point, though, you're going to have a bunch of the same resources if you keep skipping a bunch. So there will be times when you have like 3 wheat cards, and then you will be kind of stuck in where you can put resources and stuff like that. So it is still somewhat challenging, even though it does seem like you have some options available. So that's Outhouse. The Nectar Farm here, which is this building, the Nectar Farm can feed all buildings in your town if you have an even number of those buildings. Now, the buildings it's describing is the cottage here. The cottage can only score you 3 points if it's being fed. So, basically, what the Nectar Farm means is if I have 2 cottages in my town, they will all get fed, which means I'll get 6 points at the end of the game. If I have 3 cottages, however, only 2 are technically fed, and the third one is not fed, so I still only get 6 points. If I have 4 cottages in my town, then I get 3, 6, 9, 12 points. If I have 5, I still only score for the 4 cottages. So it can only feed even numbers of cottages. So basically every 2 it can feed, cottage-wise. So that's what that means. Here we have the Traveler's Center. This one is going to give me 2 victory points, and it's this building here. This green one. Okay. It's going to give me 2 victory points, and then if this building is constructed with a villager working in it, construct any building besides the monument. So this is not allowed. You can't use this ability with this monument. And then on an empty square in your town. So that's really cool. So if I build this, I can then build any building I want, as long as it's not the monument, in an empty square in my town, which is really cool. Traveler's Center is definitely going to be fun to play with, for sure. And it's worth 2 victory points. So that's awesome. And then the clock tower is also from villagers as well. You're going to get 1 point, and the clock tower is this building here. You're going to get 1 point for each unique building type in the 8 surrounding squares, except other types of this building in particular, obviously. If you have 2 of these next to each other with the clock tower, then it's going to be a -2 points. So you don't want 2 of these next to each other. because then you're going to score a -2 points next to this one. So that would not be good at all. So you want to keep these separate from each other, obviously. So maybe just building one in your entire town would be a very useful strategy, because you're limited anyways to the amount of space you have. Still, you can get 1 point for each unique building that's adjacent to this. So that's cool, as long as it's, you know, surrounding it, obviously. So that's cool. I like that one, the clock tower. And so those are the new cards from villagers that we'll be playing with in the game. Now let's talk about these 2 villager abilities. If I am going to use a villager who's currently sitting in, you know, currently working in one of these buildings, and I decide to activate cut corners, I can construct any building with 1 fewer resource than needed. So that's really cool. You'll notice that this is kind of like Tetris. All these different materials and shapes here are kind of like a Tetris looking thing. So if I was, like, for instance, wanting to cut corners with this trading post here, I could choose one of these resources in the format here and not use it in the building. So for instance, if I was going to use that ability on my turn, I could construct the trading post with perhaps without the brick. And so all I would need is the 2 wood over here and the 2 stone during the construction. So that's 1 less resource to worry about, but it can be anywhere. Doesn't really matter, but it's only 1. So that's kind of an interesting ability. Can't wait to see how that really works out for me. And then here we have renovate. If I have 3 villagers working in a building, and I decide to activate this one, I can replace any building in my town with any other building type, as long as it's not, obviously, the monument. Now, the monument card I have is this one here. It's not from villagers, so it's from the core game, Manager's Palace. I get 2 points for each unique adjacent building type. So that's kind of cool. And that's pretty much it. The trading post gives me an extra victory point for every trading post I have. But what's really cool is you may treat the trading post as a wild resource for future buildings. So I can use, this can be on the board, and I can be building sort of around it or part of my next construction with this in the mix, and this counts as a wild resource, and then I can construct a building, which is really cool because none of the other buildings can really do that. Trading post is like the only one. And then the tailor here is probably the only other card I didn't talk about because it's also from the core game. I get 1 point for the tailor, plus 1 more point for each of these types of buildings, which is the tailor, in the 4 center squares of my town. So if I place these here in the 4 center squares, I'm going to get a plus extra point for each one that's in these squares here. If I have them over here, I'm not going to get any extra points for placing them on the outer edges. So that's interesting, and then they're worth 1 point on their own anyways, so that's cool. But that's pretty much everything you need to know in order to play the new expansion Villagers. So I'm going to do a playthrough of this game, solo playthrough, and we'll see how it goes, and see how well I do. See you guys in the next video.